You are on HOA, Karen gets denied. The plow ridge was her excuse and my problem. Sandra Cooper stood in my driveway at 7:30 in the morning, jabbing her finger at the sidewalk ice patch that stretched maybe 6 feet past my property line, and told me I had exactly 24 hours to salt it, shovel the runoff channel I had supposedly created, and pay a $200 hazard cleanup deposit, or she would authorize daily escalating fines starting at $50. I have video and I have witnesses, so do not lie to me, she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the snow-muffled quiet of the street. I was holding my coffee mug still in my brown puffer jacket with the hood up because it was 12 degrees outside, and I did not say a word. I just looked at her, then at the ice, then back at her, and I could see her jaw tighten because she expected me to argue. I work as a construction project coordinator, which means I spend half my life reading contracts and the other half documenting when subcontractors try to blame someone else for their mistakes. I know how to keep records. I know when someone is setting up a paper trail to cover their own liability. And I knew, standing there with snow starting to fall again in big fat flakes, that Sandra Cooper was about to hand me everything I needed to bury her if I just stayed quiet and let her keep talking. She held up a clipboard, no readable text on the pages clipped to it, and told me the compliance patrol had documented the hazard at 11:45 the previous night during a routine winter safety sweep. She said the runoff from my driveway was the sole cause of the ice sheet and that I had violated Section 4-12 of the Quarry Ridge Snow Route Association winter maintenance rules. She said she had already notified the management company and they had authorized her to issue the fine on the spot if I refused to comply. She said all of this without taking a breath, and I just stood there, sipping my coffee, watching her face get redder. The Quarry Ridge Snow Route Association covers a neighborhood of about 60 homes in Tacoma, Washington, and it is one of those associations where every rule gets enforced like it is a matter of life and death. The board is 3 people. Sandra is the secretary, and she controls every piece of paperwork that goes in or out of the system. If you want to dispute a fine, you file through the online portal. If you want records, you request them through Sandra. If you want to attend a meeting, Sandra sends the invite. The whole operation funnels through her, and she has been using that choke point to run a personal enforcement campaign against anyone who questions her. I am trying to refinance my house because the interest rate dropped and I can save $400 a month, but the lender made it very clear that any active lien or unresolved HOA dispute would kill the deal. Sandra knows that. She knows because she sits on the architectural review committee and she sees every refinance notice that comes through. She has been waiting for leverage, and she thought she found it with this ice patch. I took another sip of coffee and asked her if she had pictures from last night. She said of course she had pictures, and she flipped the clipboard around to show me a printed photo. No readable text or timestamp visible. Just a dark sidewalk with a white gleam that could have been anything. I asked her if the compliance patrol had recorded what time they salted the sidewalk after the last plow pass, because the city schedule showed a pass at 10:15. She paused, her mouth opened, then closed. She said that was irrelevant because my driveway runoff was the contributing factor. I did not correct her lie, because I wanted her to commit to it in public. That was my first decision. I wanted her to repeat this claim, on record, in front of witnesses, so that when I finally pulled the proof I had been building for 3 weeks, it would land like a hammer. I told her I would review the notice and respond through the portal. She smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, and said, "Keep talking, I love adding notes." Then she turned and walked back to her white sedan, which was parked across the street with the engine still running. I went inside, set the coffee mug on the counter, and pulled out my phone. I opened the doorbell camera app and scrolled back to 11:45 the previous night. The footage showed Sandra walking up to my driveway with a flashlight, stopping at the sidewalk, aiming the light at the patch of ice, and taking a photo with her phone. No salt spreader, no shovel, no attempt to mark the hazard or place a cone, just a photo. Then she walked back to her car and left. The timestamp was clear, 11:47. I saved the clip and uploaded it to my personal cloud folder labeled Quarry Ridge Evidence, which already had 14 other clips, 6 email threads, and 2 sets of portal screenshots showing edits to violation entries after I had filed disputes. I had been building this file since early January, when Sandra started her winter enforcement wave, and I realized the pattern. She was targeting 3 homeowners, all of whom had spoken against a special assessment vote in December. I was one of them. The other 2 had already paid fines to make it go away. I was not going to do that. I have to take medication on schedule, a blood pressure prescription that requires consistency, and the stress of dealing with Sandra had already pushed my numbers higher than I wanted. My doctor told me to reduce conflict where I could. But sometimes you cannot reduce conflict. Sometimes you have to go through it and come out the other side with proof that it was never about the rules in the first place. I made breakfast, checked the weather forecast, and saw another 4 inches expected by evening. That meant another plow pass, another chance for Sandra to manufacture a new violation. I pulled on boots, grabbed my snow pusher, the one leaning against the spare tire in the garage, and went outside to clear the driveway approach and the little apron where it met the sidewalk. I worked slowly, methodically, making sure every motion was visible to the doorbell camera and the camera I had mounted under the eave 6 days earlier. I was not hiding anything. I was performing compliance for the record. While I was pushing the last pile of slush toward the curb, my neighbor 2 doors down, a guy named Eric, who works overnight shifts as a tow operator, came walking up the street with his dog. He stopped at the edge of my driveway and nodded toward the ice patch. "Did Sandra hit you this morning?" he asked. I said, "Yeah." He said she hit him last week for a snow pile that was technically on the curb strip, but she measured it like it was blocking the sidewalk. He said he paid the fine because he did not have time to fight it. Then he said, "If you need a witness for anything, I have been keeping my own notes." I am standing back and listening carefully to what she says, because she threatened me with daily fines too, and I want to know if she is doing this to everyone. I told him I was documenting everything, and that if it came to a hearing or a meeting, I would need people willing to show up and say what they saw. He said, "Count me in." Then he asked if I knew about the group chat. I said, "What group chat?" He pulled out his phone and showed me a screenshot. It was a text thread, 10 people, all board adjacent or compliance volunteers, with Sandra at the top of the participant list. The messages were from 2 nights ago. Sandra had written, "We need to be visible this week. The city is not salting fast enough, and we cannot let residents think they can skip their own maintenance." Someone else wrote, "Should we focus on repeat offenders?" Sandra wrote, "Start with the ones who voted no on the assessment." That is when we show we are serious. Eric said he got the screenshot from another neighbor who was in the chat briefly before Sandra kicked her out for asking too many questions. He said he saved it because he thought it might matter later. I took a picture of his screen with my phone and thanked him. He told me to be careful, because Sandra has a habit of showing up at night with the compliance patrol and leaving notices when nobody is awake to challenge her. I told him I had cameras. He said good, because she tried to get my truck towed last month, claiming it was parked illegally during a snow emergency, and the tow driver told me there was no active emergency and Sandra had called it in anyway. I went back inside and sent the new screenshot to my evidence folder. Then I logged into the HOA portal to file a formal response to the hazard cleanup fine. The portal was down. I refreshed 3 times. Same error message. I tried logging in from my laptop. Same thing. I checked the association website and saw a notice posted that morning, no readable text in the screenshot I took, saying the portal was undergoing maintenance and would be back online within 48 hours. Convenient timing. I called the management company directly. The woman who answered said she could take my dispute over the phone and log it manually. I gave her my name, the violation number from the notice Sandra had stuffed in my mailbox, and a summary of why the fine was baseless. She said she would forward it to the compliance coordinator. I asked who that was. She said Sandra Cooper. I told her that was a conflict of interest because Sandra was the one who issued the fine. She said she understood my concern, but that was the current structure and I would need to bring it up at the next board meeting if I wanted to change it. I asked when that was. She said the next meeting was not scheduled yet. I hung up and wrote an email to the full board using the addresses listed on the association website. I kept it short and factual. I outlined the fine, the timeline, the lack of evidence that my driveway runoff caused the ice, and the fact that the portal was conveniently down right when I needed to file a dispute. I attached the doorbell camera clip showing Sandra taking a photo at 11:47 with no attempt to remediate the hazard herself. I sent it and got an auto reply from Sandra saying she was out of the office and would respond within 3 business days. The other 2 board members did not reply at all. 2 days passed. I cleared my driveway after every snowfall. I salted the apron. I took photos with timestamps. I documented everything. On the 3rd morning, I woke up to another notice in my mailbox. This one said I had failed to remediate the original hazard within the 24-hour deadline and that the daily escalating fine had been activated. $50 per day starting yesterday. Total balance now $300, due within 7 days or subject to lien filing. I looked at the signature line. Sandra Cooper, Compliance Coordinator. I took a picture of the notice and added it to the folder. Then I walked outside and looked at the sidewalk. The ice patch was gone. It had melted 2 days ago when the temperature spiked to 40 degrees for an afternoon. There was no hazard. There had not been a hazard for 48 hours. But Sandra had still issued the escalating fine, backdated to the day after her original notice, because she was not interested in compliance. She was interested in punishment. I called the management company again and asked to speak to someone above the compliance coordinator. The receptionist transferred me to a property manager named Lauren, who said she had reviewed my email and the attached video. She said the video was compelling, but that Sandra had submitted a written report stating that the ice patch was still present as of the deadline and that I had not provided proof of remediation. I told her the video showed Sandra had done nothing to address the hazard herself and that the city plow schedule proved the ice was caused by municipal runoff, not my driveway. Lauren said she appreciated my documentation, but that without an independent third-party inspection, it was my word against Sandra's, and the board had the authority to levy fines based on their own observations. I asked her if the management company was aware that Sandra was using after-hours compliance patrols to target specific homeowners who had opposed board actions. Lauren paused. She said that was a serious allegation, and I would need to provide evidence. I said I had evidence, and I was prepared to present it at the next board meeting. She said she would make sure the board scheduled a meeting within 2 weeks. I said thank you and hung up. That afternoon, Sandra showed up at my driveway again. This time she had a folding sign stand, the kind with a metal frame and a blank corrugated plastic panel, no readable text. She set it up on the curb strip right at the edge of my property, about 3 feet from the sidewalk. I opened the front door and asked her what she was doing. She said she was marking a chronic non-compliance location as required by the winter safety protocol. I asked her what protocol. She said it was adopted at the December meeting. I said I did not receive notice of that meeting. She said all notices go through the portal, and if I did not check the portal, that was my problem. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit the like button and subscribe, because this story is just getting started and you do not want to miss what happens next. I stepped outside and walked up to the sign. I asked her if she had measurements, timestamps, or any documentation proving my property was a chronic non-compliance location. She smiled and said, "Keep talking. I love adding notes." Then she pulled out her phone and held it up like she was recording. I looked directly at the camera and said my name, the date, the time, and the fact that Sandra Cooper had placed an unapproved sign on the curb strip without HOA architectural review or city permit. I said the sign was in violation of Tacoma Municipal Code regarding obstructions in the public right-of-way, and that I would be filing a complaint with the city and a separate complaint with the management company. Sandra lowered the phone. She said the sign stays. I said we would see. She left. I took photos of the sign from 4 angles, including close-ups showing it was on the curb strip, not my property. Then I called Tacoma Public Works and filed a complaint about an unauthorized obstruction in the right-of-way. The clerk said they would send someone out within 3 business days. I asked if they could come sooner. She said they would do their best, but winter response times were slower. I thanked her and hung up. That night, at 10:30, my doorbell camera triggered a motion alert. I opened the app and watched Sandra walk up to my driveway again, this time with another person, a man in a dark coat I did not recognize. They stopped at the folding sign, adjusted it slightly, and then Sandra aimed her phone at my front door and took a photo. The man said something I could not hear. Sandra nodded, and they walked back to her car. I saved the clip immediately and added it to the evidence folder. The next morning, the city inspector came out and looked at the sign. He measured the distance from the curb, took photos, and told me the sign was technically in the right-of-way and he would issue a notice to remove it. He asked if I knew who placed it. I said yes. He said he would send the notice to the HOA and the property owner of record. I thanked him and asked how long the HOA had to remove it. He said 72 hours or they could be fined. I logged into the portal, which was back online, and saw a new entry in my violation history. It was dated 2 days prior, after Sandra had issued the escalating fine notice, but the timestamp on the entry showed it had been created yesterday. The description had been edited. The original text, which I had screenshotted during my first dispute, said driveway runoff creating ice hazard on sidewalk. The new text said chronic failure to maintain sidewalk and curb strip, multiple complaints, hazard persists after repeated warnings. I took a screenshot of the edited entry and compared it to the original. They did not match. The edit log was blank. That was the twist. Sandra was changing the records after the fact to make it look like I had a pattern of violations, when in reality there was only one alleged incident and it was based on a lie. The portal showed no edit history. There was no audit trail. She had back-end access, and she was using it to fabricate a compliance narrative that would justify escalating enforcement and potentially a lien filing. If I had not taken screenshots from day one, I would have no proof that the entries had been altered. I called Lauren at the management company and told her the portal entries had been changed. She said she would look into it. I asked her if the management company kept independent logs. She said they received summary reports from the board but did not maintain a separate database. I asked her if she could request a full audit of the portal. She said that would require board approval. I told her the board secretary was the one altering the records. She said she understood my concern and she would bring it to the board president. I spent the next 2 days gathering every piece of evidence I had. I created a timeline document with timestamps for every notice, every conversation, every portal edit, every doorbell camera clip. I printed the group chat screenshot. I printed the city plow schedule showing the 10:15 pass on the night before Sandra issued the first fine. I printed the city inspector's notice about the unauthorized sign. I compiled it all into a folder, physical and digital, and I labeled it Quarry Ridge Compliance Abuse Evidence. Then Sandra escalated again. I came home from a job site meeting and found a tow truck idling at the curb in front of my house. The driver was standing next to my car, which was parked in my own driveway, and he was holding a clipboard. I walked up and asked what was going on. He said he had received a call from the HOA reporting an unregistered vehicle parked in violation of snow emergency parking rules. I told him my car was registered, it was in my driveway, and there was no active snow emergency. He said he was just following the dispatch order. I asked who called it in. He checked his paperwork and said Sandra Cooper. I pulled out my phone and showed him the Tacoma City website page for snow emergencies. No active declaration. He looked at it, then looked at his clipboard and said he was going to call his dispatcher and verify. He walked back to his truck. I stood next to my car and waited. 2 minutes later, he came back and said the order was canceled and he was not towing anything. He said this was the second time this month someone from this HOA had called in a bogus tow request and his company was going to start charging a cancellation fee if it kept happening. I asked if he remembered the other call. He said yeah, it was for a pickup truck 2 streets over. Same caller, no valid emergency. He said he had noted it in the system. I thanked him and watched him drive away. Then I took photos of my car, my driveway, the empty street, and the city website page showing no snow emergency. I added them to the evidence folder. I also noted the tow operator's company name from the side of his truck because Eric had mentioned a similar incident and I wanted to connect the pattern. That night, I sent an email to every homeowner in the association. I used the directory list that was posted on the HOA website, which included everyone's email address. I kept the subject line neutral. Urgent, winter compliance enforcement concerns. In the body, I explained that multiple residents had been targeted with questionable fines and bogus tow attempts, that the HOA portal was being used to alter violation records after disputes were filed, and that I had compiled documentation showing a pattern of harassment directed at homeowners who had opposed board actions. I attached 3 pieces of evidence: the doorbell camera clip of Sandra photographing my door at night, the screenshot comparison showing the edited portal entry, and the group chat screenshot showing Sandra's message about targeting assessment opponents. I ended with a request for anyone who had similar experiences to contact me and consider attending the next board meeting. I hit send at 9 p.m. By 11 p.m., I had 12 replies. By the next morning, I had 23. People were angry. 3 of them forwarded additional screenshots showing Sandra had issued them fines for violations that either did not exist or were caused by city snow removal operations, not homeowner negligence. 2 people said they had paid fines just to avoid escalation. One person said Sandra had threatened him with a lien filing, and he had hired a lawyer who was now reviewing the HOA governing documents for procedural violations. Lauren from the management company called me at 10 a.m. She said the board president had reached out and requested an emergency meeting to address the compliance concerns. She said the meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the clubhouse. She said it would be recorded and open to all homeowners. I asked if Sandra would be present. Lauren said yes. I asked if I could present evidence. She said yes, there would be a comment period. I thanked her and told her I would be there. I spent the rest of the day organizing my presentation. I created a simple outline, timeline of events, evidence of targeted enforcement, proof of portal tampering, documentation of the bogus tow attempts, and the group chat screenshot as the smoking gun. I printed extra copies of everything in case anyone wanted to review the documents themselves. I also reached out to Eric and asked if he would be willing to speak at the meeting as a witness. He said yes. I asked if he had any additional documentation. He said he had his own doorbell camera footage showing Sandra and the compliance patrol placing a violation notice on his door at 11:30 at night without knocking. I told him to bring it. The meeting started at 7 p.m. The clubhouse was packed. At least 40 people showed up, which was more than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting. Sandra was sitting at the front table with the board president and the treasurer. She looked calm, composed, like she had done this 100 times before. The board president opened the meeting and said they were here to address concerns about winter compliance enforcement and that there would be an open comment period after a brief board report. Sandra stood up and delivered a 5-minute statement about the importance of winter safety, the association's responsibility to maintain clear sidewalks and roadways, and the compliance team's efforts to ensure residents were meeting their obligations. She said a small number of residents had been resistant to enforcement and had chosen to dispute fines rather than comply with simple requests. She said the board stood behind every fine that had been issued and that any claims of improper conduct were baseless. She said if residents had concerns, they should file through the proper channels instead of spreading misinformation via mass email. She sat down. The board president asked if anyone wanted to speak during the comment period. I raised my hand. He called on me. I stood up, walked to the front, and set my folder on the table. I said my name and my address. Then I said I was here to present documentation showing that the winter compliance enforcement campaign was not about safety. It was about retaliation. I opened the folder and pulled out the timeline. I walked through each event, the first fine issued based on an ice patch that was caused by city runoff, not my driveway. The doorbell camera clip showing Sandra photographing the alleged hazard without attempting to remediate it. The escalating fine notice issued after the hazard had already melted. The folding sign placed in the public right-of-way without a permit. The bogus tow attempt. The group chat screenshot showing Sandra had explicitly instructed the compliance team to target residents who opposed the special assessment. I held up the screenshot comparison showing the portal entry had been edited after I filed my dispute, and I explained that the edit log was blank. which meant someone with back-end access had altered the record to make it appear I had a pattern of violations, when in reality there was only one alleged inside, NT. I said that someone was Sandra Cooper, the compliance coordinator, who had both the motive and the means to fabricate a paper trail that would justify escalating fines and a potential lien filing. Sandra stood up and said that was a lie. She said the portal entries were accurate and that I was manipulating screenshots to support a false narrative. I pulled out my phone, opened the screenshots folder, and held it up so the board president could see the date stamps. I said the original screenshot was taken on the day I filed my first dispute, and the edited version was taken 3 days later, after Sandra had issued the escalating fine notice. I said the metadata was intact, and I was happy to provide the raw files for independent verification. The room went quiet. The board president asked Sandra if she had altered any portal entries. Sandra said she had updated the description to reflect the full scope of the violation after reviewing additional field reports. I asked her to produce those field reports. She said they were internal compliance documents. I said that was not an answer. The board president asked her again. She said she would provide them at a later date. Eric stood up from the back of the room and said he wanted to speak. The board president called on him. Eric walked to the front and said his name and address. Then he said Sandra had issued him a fine for a snow pile that was on the curb strip, not the sidewalk, and when he disputed it, she had threatened him with daily escalating fines unless he paid immediately. He said he paid the fine because he did not have time to fight it, but he had since learned that at least 5 other residents had received similar threats, and all of them had opposed the special assessment in December. He said that was not enforcement. That was targeted harassment. Another resident stood up and said Sandra had called in a bogus tow request on her vehicle last month, claiming it was parked illegally during a snow emergency, when no emergency had been declared. Another resident said Sandra had placed a violation notice on his door at 2 in the morning, and his doorbell camera caught the whole thing. Another resident said Sandra had refused to process his dispute through the portal and told him he had to pay the fine first and appeal later, which was not how the governing documents worked. The board president held up his hands and said this was getting out of hand. He said the board would review all the complaints and schedule a follow-up meeting to address procedural concerns. Sandra stood up and said she had been doing her job in good faith, and that this was a coordinated attack by a small group of residents who did not want to follow the rules. I looked at her and said that was interesting, because I had not corrected her lie about the snow emergency or the ice hazard cause, because I wanted her to commit to it in public, and now she had done exactly that in front of 40 witnesses and a recording device. She stared at me. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, the one I had been holding back. I said I had obtained a gate access audit log from the city showing my driveway access lane had been deliberately blocked by an HOA-placed barricade on the same night Sandra claimed I had caused the sidewalk ice hazard. The barricade had been placed at 10 p.m., which meant I could not have accessed my driveway to cause runoff at the time she claimed the hazard occurred. The log showed the barricade was removed at 8 a.m. the next morning after Sandra had already issued the fine. I said the barricade placement was not documented anywhere in the HOA records, but it was documented in the city's right-of-way management system, because the HOA had filed for a temporary permit and the permit number was attached to the log entry. I said I had not mentioned the barricade earlier because I wanted Sandra to repeat her claim one last time, on record, so there would be no ambiguity about whether she knew the hazard narrative was false. I held up the audit log printout and said the barricade was placed by the compliance team under Sandra's authorization, and the city permit application was signed by Sandra Cooper. I said that meant Sandra had deliberately blocked my driveway access, then blamed me for a hazard I could not have caused, and then altered the portal records to make it look like I had a history of non-compliance. The room exploded. People were shouting. The board president was banging his hand on the table trying to restore order. Sandra was standing at the front table, face bright red, yelling that I was twisting the facts and that the barricade was part of a legitimate snow removal operation. I asked her why the barricade was not mentioned in any HOA communication or compliance report. She said it was an oversight. I said an oversight does not explain why the portal entry was edited to remove any reference to the barricade after I filed my dispute. The board president called a recess. He said the board needed to consult with the management company and legal counsel before proceeding. He said the meeting would resume in 15 minutes. Sandra walked out of the room. I stayed at the front table and several residents came up to thank me for speaking up. One of them said she had been planning to sell her house and move because she could not deal with Sandra anymore, and now she felt like maybe there was a chance the situation could be fixed. When the meeting resumed, the board president said the board had voted to place Sandra on administrative leave pending an investigation into the compliance enforcement procedures and the portal record-keeping practices. He said the management company would take over compliance coordination on an interim basis, and that all pending fines issued in the past 60 days would be frozen until the investigation was complete. He said the board would schedule a special meeting within 2 weeks to present the findings and discuss next steps. Sandra stood up and said this was a witch hunt. She said she had served the association for 6 years, and this was how they repaid her. She said she would not be placed on leave, and if the board tried to remove her, she would file a lawsuit. The board president said the decision was final, and if Sandra chose to pursue legal action, that was her right, but the administrative leave was effective immediately. Sandra grabbed her coat and walked out. She did not look at anyone. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. As people were leaving, Lauren from the management company pulled me aside and said she wanted to thank me for bringing the documentation forward. She said the management company had been concerned about Sandra's enforcement patterns for a while, but they did not have enough evidence to act. She said my timeline and the audit log were exactly what they needed to justify an independent review. She said if the investigation confirmed the findings, the management company would recommend that the board terminate Sandra's position and implement new oversight procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future. I went home and uploaded the meeting recording to my evidence folder. Then I sent a follow-up email to the homeowners who had replied to my original message, summarizing what had happened at the meeting and letting them know the board had frozen all pending fines. I thanked them for showing up and for speaking during the comment period. I said the investigation was just beginning and I would keep everyone updated as it progressed. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the management company. It said the board had completed an expedited review of the compliance records and had found multiple instances of improper documentation, unauthorized enforcement actions, and policy violations. It said the board had voted to remove Sandra Cooper from her position as compliance coordinator and board secretary effective immediately. It said all fines issued under Sandra's authority in the past 90 days were being rescinded and refunds would be processed within 30 days. It said the board was implementing a new compliance oversight committee with rotating membership to ensure transparency and accountability. The letter also said the management company had identified 2 other board members who had been aware of Sandra's practices and had failed to intervene. Both had submitted resignations. The board president was still in place, but he had agreed to step down at the end of his term and not seek re-election. The letter said the association would hold a special election in 60 days to fill the vacant seats, and that all candidates would be required to complete ethics training before taking office. I called Lauren and asked what had triggered the expedited review. She said the audit log evidence I had presented made it clear that Sandra had not only altered records, she had also coordinated with the compliance patrol to create false enforcement scenarios, and that crossed the line from aggressive enforcement into fraud. She said the management company had notified their legal team and the HOA's insurance carrier because there was potential liability if other residents filed claims based on similar conduct. She said the board had no choice but to act immediately to limit exposure. I asked her if Sandra would face any legal consequences. Lauren said that was up to the board and any affected residents who chose to pursue claims. She said the management company was recommending that the board offer settlement agreements to any homeowner who had paid fines under Sandra's enforcement, with a provision that the homeowner would waive further claims in exchange for a full refund and a written apology. She said it was a standard liability mitigation strategy and most people would probably take it rather than hire a lawyer and go through a lengthy dispute process. I thought about it and decided I did not need a settlement. I just wanted the fines rescinded and the record cleared. The refund of fees that hits the ledger like a slap was enough for me. I told Lauren I would accept the refund and move on as long as the new compliance structure had real oversight and Sandra was permanently barred from any HOA role. Lauren said that was already part of the resolution. Sandra had been placed on a no-contact directive by management, which meant she was not allowed to communicate with any homeowner or board member regarding HOA business, and any future attempt to serve on the board or a committee would result in immediate removal and potential legal action. 3 weeks later, I received a check for $300, the full amount of the fines Sandra had issued. It came with a letter from the new interim board president apologizing for the enforcement practices and outlining the changes that had been implemented. The letter said the association was committed to fair and transparent governance, and that residents should feel confident that their concerns would be heard and addressed promptly. The same week, the city removed the folding sign from the curb strip. The public works inspector sent me a follow-up email saying the HOA had been fined for placing an unauthorized obstruction in the right-of-way, and that future violations would result in escalated penalties. He said the fine was $250, which I found darkly funny, because that was almost exactly what Sandra had tried to charge me for the fake ice hazard. Eric stopped by one afternoon and said the management company had refunded his fine too, and he had heard from at least 6 other residents who got the same letter. He said people were talking about forming a homeowners advocacy group to make sure the new board stayed accountable. He asked if I wanted to be involved. I said maybe, but I needed a break first. He laughed and said he understood. The special election happened in early March. 3 new board members were elected, all of them people who had been vocal about transparency and had no prior ties to Sandra or the old compliance structure. The new board held its first meeting 2 weeks later and passed a resolution requiring all compliance actions to be reviewed by the management company before fines could be issued. They also implemented a formal appeals process with a third-party mediator and required quarterly audits of the HOA portal to ensure records were not being altered. Sandra moved out of the neighborhood a month later. I saw the for sale sign go up one morning when I was clearing the last of the winter slush from my driveway. Eric texted me a photo of the moving truck and said good riddance. I agreed. The house sold within 2 weeks, which told me she was motivated to leave fast. I finalized my refinance in April. The lender confirmed there were no active liens or disputes on record, and the closing went through without any issues. I saved $412 a month, which made the whole fight worth it in a very concrete financial sense. But more than that, I felt like I had stopped something that was going to keep happening to other people if nobody spoke up. The neighborhood settled into a quieter rhythm after that. The new board was not perfect, but they were responsive. When someone had a question about a rule or a fine, they could get a straight answer instead of a runaround. The compliance patrol still did winter checks, but they focused on actual safety hazards instead of manufactured violations. People stopped walking on eggshells every time it snowed. I kept the evidence folder on my computer, just in case. I labeled it Quarry Ridge Receipts and I backed it up to 3 different cloud services. I figured if Sandra ever tried to come back, or if someone else on the board decided to follow her playbook, I would be ready. But I also hoped I would never have to open that folder again. One night in late April, after the last of the snow had finally melted, I was sitting on the front porch with a beer, watching the street, and Eric walked by with his dog. He stopped and asked how I was doing. I said good. He said he heard the management company had disciplined the rep who enabled Sandra's enforcement campaign by failing to flag the portal edits and the barricade permit application, which had been submitted outside normal procedures. I said that was the HOA consequence I had been hoping for, because the system only works if the people running it have accountability. Eric said he also heard Karen gets placed on a no-contact directive by management had been extended to cover all future HOA interactions, not just the immediate dispute period. I said good. He said a couple of people had asked him if I was planning to run for the board. I said absolutely not. He laughed and said that was probably the right answer. The funny karma beat came a few days later. Someone posted in the neighborhood group chat, which had been quiet since the investigation, that the city had issued a public notice about winter snow removal policies. The notice clarified that the ice hazard Sandra had blamed on me was actually caused by a blocked storm drain that the city had failed to clear before the January freeze, and the city was accepting liability for any sidewalk damage or slip and fall incidents that occurred during that period. Karen calls it a snow emergency, and the city notice disproves it. The timing was almost perfect. If Sandra had waited one more week before issuing that first fine, the city notice would have been public, and her whole narrative would have collapsed immediately. But she had been in such a hurry to weaponize the enforcement rules that she had walked straight into a trap of her own making. I printed a copy of the city notice and added it to the receipts folder, not because I needed it for any legal purpose, but because it felt like a fitting end to the whole saga. The person who had spent 6 years hammering residents over minor rule violations had been undone by a basic fact-checking failure and her own eagerness to escalate before she had all the information. It was darkly funny in the way that real-life payback sometimes is, where the universe does not hand you a dramatic courtroom victory or a public meltdown. It just quietly proves you were right and lets everyone else figure out what that means. The refinance savings kept hitting my account every month. The new board kept the compliance rules reasonable. The snow pusher stayed in the garage, waiting for next winter, which would hopefully be less eventful. I still checked the doorbell camera footage every few days, out of habit more than necessity, but there were no more late-night compliance patrols, no more folding signs, no more bogus tow attempts. The street was just a street again, with the usual neighborhood flow, the usual minor annoyances, but nothing that felt like targeted harassment or coordinated retaliation. I ran into one of the other residents who had been targeted by Sandra, a woman who lived 3 streets over and had paid 2 separate fines before the investigation shut everything down. She stopped me in the grocery store parking lot one afternoon and said she wanted to thank me for standing up at the meeting. She said she had been afraid to speak because Sandra had threatened her with a lien filing if she disputed the fines, and she did not have the time or money to fight it. She said when I presented the audit log evidence and the portal screenshots, it was the first time she felt like someone with receipts was willing to go on record, and it gave her the courage to file for her own refund. She said the check arrived last week and it felt like justice, even if it was just a couple $100. I told her I was glad it worked out and that the new board seemed committed to making sure it did not happen again. She said she hoped so. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that the stakes for some people were not just financial or procedural. They were emotional. The stress of wondering if your home could be liened over a made-up violation. The frustration of seeing your dispute ignored or buried in a broken portal system. The anger of realizing that someone in a position of authority was using that authority to punish you for having an opinion. All of that takes a toll. And when the system finally corrects itself, even partially, it matters. The last piece of fallout came in May when the HOA hired a new management company liaison to handle compliance coordination and resident communications. Her name was Rachel, and she introduced herself by sending a welcome email to every homeowner with clear instructions on how to file a concern, how the appeals process worked, and what the timeline for responses would be. She included her direct phone number and said she would hold monthly office hours at the clubhouse for anyone who wanted to talk in person. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of transparency that had been missing under Sandra's regime, and people noticed. I never heard from Sandra again. No emails, no letters, no surprise visits, nothing. She disappeared from the neighborhood ecosystem completely, and it felt like the air pressure had dropped to normal levels. The new board kept moving forward. The compliance structure stayed balanced. The association stopped being a source of constant stress and became what it was supposed to be from the start, a boring administrative body that handled boring administrative tasks without turning every snow pile into a federal case. I finished clearing out the last of my project files from the winter and archived the evidence folder under a simple label that I would recognize if I ever needed it again. I did not delete it. I just moved it off the desktop and let it sit quietly in the cloud, a reminder that documentation works, that patience works, and that sometimes the best revenge is just letting someone talk themselves into a corner while you keep the receipts ready. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.